Hey guys, Mr. V over here, doing a book review today for Gulag or History by Applebaum. Now, this book is a nonfiction book about the Gulag system in the Soviet Union, which was basically a prison system where they just forced you to do labor, forced you to do work. Now, I read the Gulag Archipelago about 2 years ago. That book was released in 1973 as from a different author, but this book was a much more complete history of it because this book was released in 2003. And because of that, there was just so much more complete information on it. And because after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a lot more information about the camps. There was a lot more behind the scenes information, more statistics were published, and there's just more stories. As more people, she was able to do a lot more research and just get a lot more done. Now, one thing you should know about the Gulag system, and she covers it, is that this was a forced labor camp, which is different than the Nazi concentration camps. Because while death did occur, it was just a whole different thing. Again, they just sent you to this camp and forced you to do labor for the country. And she points out the differences, and she shows how brutal those camps were because this was just such a brutal system. The gulags were just so brutal, and she gives a great history of the camps. She gives overall like general history of like the Russian history, just a very brief, because it helps understanding the whole situation of the Soviet Union. Because she shows how the Soviet Union was such a tough place. There were so many failed programs there, and this became so much worse after Stalin took over. And then she goes back to cover what the first gulags were like, because the first gulags were even tougher, and just setting up the whole system. And she shows the progression through the years, but also like how scary the gulags became and how by the 1930s they had the system in place and just how scary gulags were because they even had like the forced labor was so tough that they even had like quotas for arrests. They started making up charges so that no one was safe. Even like the top camp leaders were arrested sometimes, and people that were in power for years were all of a sudden arrested because they were running the camps. Then they had to make up charges and throw those leaders in, and she just shows you things beyond the Gulag system and how the Soviet Union leaders, how they just kept control because they would just cause paranoia in society as they would make up these charges. So it just caused fear and paranoia where you were always suspicious of everyone around you, and you never would talk to neighbors. You never did things because you never knew who would say something, and then later, like the KGB come and arrest you and send you to one of these camps for years. And it just shows just how it was. So she shows the setup of the gulags, but then goes through the arrest process, which was just horrible. And like not every process was the same because some people were put into solitary confinement, others were put into overcrowded cells, some were tortured, there were so many things. And then they were sentenced to over 5 years. Some people were sentenced to 10 years, 15 years, even 25 years in the system, and it was just tough. And she just gives so many stories, and you get to see like you just get a complete picture because of all those stories. But it's like after that, then there was the travel to camp, which was really tough because they just put you into like these cattle cars and they sent you to these camps, and the travel would sometimes take you weeks to get to the camps, and they sent you to completely different areas. But they gave you like so little water and so little food, and some people even died on the way to camp. Like that's just how brutal it was. Then you finally arrive at the camps, and the camp was worst of all because they just forced you into labor. It was a forced labor camp, and they just worked you crazy amounts, like easily 12-hour days and like no rest time, and it was just crazy. And you either worked or you got tortured. But even in the camp, the sleeping conditions were terrible. They gave you like no blankets or very thin blankets in these super cold areas. They gave you very little food and water. You would fight each other. There was just these like gross areas that were never cleaned. You get a shower maybe like once a week and give you close to no soap or very little water. But the food was just horrible. They gave you so little. Not everyone even had bowls. And she shows in the book like different types of things people would do to get a bowl and make their own bowls, and just how people would fight for it. It is just again, she goes through the whole situation. She goes through the whole situation and just how difficult it was at every stage, but she goes in depth. And that's what made the book really good, is that she goes in depth so that you just see everything. You see how the guards treated the prisoners. You see how the prisoners treated each other, and just how there was different types of prisoners. There were criminals, but then there were like the fake criminals because they had fake charges brought against them. There were political prisoners, there were prisoners of war, and there were even women and children in the camp. And that was definitely an interesting section because most people who have done research on the Gulag see that actually women and children are kind of overlooked. People don't write about that as much, but it was definitely a very, very sad section, but very interesting because that again was an area that's rarely covered. And the last section of the book covers the collapse of the Soviet Union and the closing of the Gulag. But again, it was a collapse. But what it was like for some of these prisoners who had to go back to society, even ones that were released before the collapse, but how they had to go back to society and face some of these people who made something up about them and sent them to the system and sent them to the Gulag. I mean, like, and how do you face these people again? And it was just, she shows what that was like. And there was just so many different stories, so many different camps, so many different years. She just covers it all. And you just see, like, it was amazing that people even survived mentally and physically because of how tough it was there. But it was a very interesting read. It was a scary read. It was a very scary one reading because it feels like it's fake. It feels like you're like reading about a movie, but this really happened to people. And the other part that was scary was that these stories didn't just happen over like 1 month or even 3 months. This happened, like some people were sentenced to like 10 years. And just thinking about that, wow, someone served 10 years in these types of camps and just how brutal it was. And it just makes you appreciate life. It makes you appreciate just some of the simple foods you have, even a bed or even a shower. When you're reading it, just like, wow, it really makes you appreciate it. And while this was a great book, I thought it was a great book. This was a book that I could not read quickly. The audio book was 28 hours, but I could not read it as quickly as a normal 28-hour book. It was very well written, but because it was such a tough subject, I could not overload myself. There were times where I had to take small breaks, where I would take like 2 weeks off from reading it, just because of how tough a subject it was. Again, I could not overload myself, but it was definitely worth the read. If you guys are interested in the Soviet Union, then read this book because it shows what the prison system was like in the Soviet Union and just how brutal life was. So again, if you're interested in that, I definitely recommend this, as this was a great book to show that. But if you guys have any comments, you have any questions, please post it in the comment section below because I love hearing your comments, your opinions, and just everything you guys talk about. But if you guys enjoyed the book review, hit the subscribe button, as I always upload multiple different book reviews. But thank you for watching my book review today. This is Mr. V over here. Go enjoy reading.